We're revisiting the DNA of Redeemer City to City, which of course was formulated to some degree in the most recently formulated in the book Center Church, which is 10 years old now. And so what we want to do in these white papers and these talks is to revisit all the aspects of the DNA. We want to also, in a sense, enrich our understanding of them so that we can re-articulate them in our particular times and particular contexts around the world. And so the talks are basically going through the main headings of the white papers. So it's by far the best for you to both listen to the talk and read the white papers. You can either read the white paper and then listen to the talk, or the talk first and the white papers. That does not matter. But it's far better if you read the white paper as well as hear the talk, rather than just hear the talk. The gospel, the first, the most basic of the aspects of the DNA. We must never lose it, we must never assume it, and we must never tire of it. Now what I mean by that is, first of all, when I say we must never lose it, I'm thinking of Galatians 1, where Paul comes right out and says, you might have all kinds of other Christian doctrines down. You may have the right view of the person of Jesus Christ, or you might have the right view of the Trinity, or you might have all kinds of right views. But if you actually lose the gospel, then all those other doctrines can't help you. You've lost everything. So we must never lose it. Secondly, we must never assume it. And I'm thinking of Galatians 2, where Paul actually has to confront Peter, another apostle who used to eat with the Gentiles but had fallen back into his older Jewishness, which was, you don't eat with unclean Gentiles. And he had started to, in a sense, lose his grip on the gospel. And Paul was not assuming that just because you're Peter, that of course you know the gospel. He didn't assume it. He made sure that we were looking at ourselves constantly to say, have we still got our grip on the gospel? So we mustn't lose it, we mustn't assume it, and we must never tire of it. And here I'm thinking of 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 10 to 12, where it says, even the angels long to look into the gospel. They never get tired of it. And so that's what we're looking at it again. Now, let's start this way. I'd like to basically talk to you about what is the gospel, the concept of it, definition of it, and then what are the implications of the gospel? What are the issues surrounding it? The gospel assumes that everyone is seeking salvation, even though the vast majority of people in the world who are seeking salvation don't use the word and don't think in those terms. But the whole idea behind the gospel is, the premise of the gospel is that here's how Jesus Christ saves you. And therefore, it assumes that everyone is looking for salvation. Now, I believe the gospel is absolutely right in assuming that everyone actually is looking for salvation. Because basically everyone believes the world is not as it ought to be, that human beings are not what they ought to be, and that, generally speaking, you are not what you ought to be. Now, people have very different understandings of that and why those things are the case, but by and large, it's true that everyone understands that we are not what we ought to be, people aren't what they ought to be, and the world is not what it ought to be. Even modern, Western, individualistic, therapeutic culture. From Rousseau to Freud, we've been told that there's nothing wrong with me, it's just the world out there that's messing me up. But even modern Western therapeutic culture has narratives of liberation saying that we need to be liberated, which means we need to be saved, even though we don't use the term. But the gospel rightly assumes that everyone believes that there's something wrong and we need to be saved from whatever it is that's wrong. And then, so what is the core of the gospel? Now, what I'm about to do is give you not a gospel presentation, but what I think is the core of the gospel that always has to be there when we talk about the gospel, however we present it. Now, when I say I want to talk to you about the core rather than give you a gospel presentation, there is no one gospel presentation that the Bible gives us. The Bible gives us a number of different presentations of the gospel. And I would say when I listen to people present the gospel today, in most places I've gone, most of the gospel presentations tend to fall either into the category of what I would call God, sin, Christ, faith. It's more individual. It's saying This is what you owe God. We have sinned. Jesus Christ has paid the price, and here's how you receive it through faith. And it's more how a person actually connects to the salvation of the gospel. The other way I've heard people talk about the gospel is creation, fall, redemption, restoration. The world was good. We have screwed it up. Jesus Christ comes back to restore the world. And that has more to do with the giving people a panoramic view of all that salvation is supposed to accomplish. Here's what I want to say. However you decide you're presenting the gospel, you must keep in the gospel this core. And here's what I mean by the core. Number one, we're saved by grace, Christ's grace, not by our moral efforts. That's got to be in there. Number two, we are saved by what Christ has done, not by what we have done. That's not identical to the first one. So we're saved by grace, not by good works. We're saved by Christ's works, not our works. Thirdly, we receive this and connect to this salvation just the way Jesus Christ accomplished it, through weakness. Not by summoning up our strength, but admitting we're weak and repenting and lifting the empty hands of faith and saying, fill me, save me, change me. And then lastly, if we make that connection, the result is a new creation. Not just a new creation individually, but eventually a new creation of the entire world. See, that's what I'm calling the good news, the bad news, the good news, and the great news. The bad news is that we're all trying to save ourselves, one way or another, individually and corporately, through looking to things rather than God to do it. And that means that corporately we might be looking to wealth and power, and that's one of the reasons we have systems of injustice. So various groups or are looking for salvation, as it were, through wealth and power or military might. Individuals are looking for salvation by a sense of self-worth and a sense of significance through accomplishment or through sexuality and through loving relationships or through career and that sort of thing. But we're all trying to save ourselves and we're failing. That's the bad news. The good news is Jesus Christ came and lived the life we should have lived, died the death we should have died, in our place. And by living the life we should have lived, he earned the blessing that only a perfect human life would merit. But then at the end of his life, he took the curse that we deserved, so that instead of taking the blessing he deserved, at the end he took the curse, so that leaves for us the blessing. So 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, God made him sin who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. You hear that? When it says God made him sin, that doesn't mean that on the cross he became sinful. It means God treated him as sinful. And therefore when it says God made him sin who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God in him, that is not saying so that we might actually be righteous. Yes, eventually we will be. But what it means is just as Jesus Christ was treated as if he'd done everything we've done, the moment you believe that you are treated as if we have done or you have done everything that he's done, you're treated with all the love and honor that Jesus Christ deserves. And of course that's the good news, and it leads to the great news, which is someday God is not only going to renovate us individually and turn us into perfect glorified beings, but he's going to renovate the entire world. So injustice will be gone, and suffering will be gone, and death itself will be gone. Now, what are the implications of this gospel? Or what are the issues around the gospel? And here are 5, and then I'm done, okay? Number 1, the gospel is more than forgiveness. Over the years, as I've been preaching and ministering, I've discovered that an awful lot of people only have half a gospel because they basically believe that when they hear the gospel, they think, well, that means Jesus died for my sins so that when I do something wrong, he forgives me. See, the average person understands that means that they got half the gospel. That they believe that on the one hand, Jesus died for me so my sins are covered. On the other hand, they believe what that means is a second chance now to do really well. I've talked to so many people over the years, in fact, fairly recently to somebody else who said, I know I don't deserve heaven, and Jesus died for my sin, but if I really live like him and really trust in him and try to be like Jesus, then I think he'll let me into my heaven. So you see, my sins have been covered, But the idea is it's still up to me to be like Jesus. Whereas actually, as I just said, the gospel is not only that our sins are put on Christ, but his righteousness and record is put on us. And that's the reason why it's not just that we get a second chance. We're not just forgiven, but we're also received and accepted. I think it's Richard Hooker that has this wonderful place. He was a 16th century Englishman who said, "So are we in the sight of God the Father, as is the very Son of God himself." Hear that? So are we in the sight of God the Father, as is the very Son of God himself. And then Hooker goes on and says, "Let it be counted as folly or frenzy or fury whatsoever. This is our wisdom and our comfort. We care for no knowledge in the world but this, that man has sinned and God has suffered, that God has made himself the sin of man, and that men are now made the righteousness of God. You see, therefore, that the Church of Rome, in teaching justification by inherent grace, does pervert the truth of Christ, and that by the hands of his apostles we have received otherwise than she, the Roman Catholic Church, teaches." So the gospel is more than forgiveness. It's also acceptance. Secondly, you have to realize the gospel is neither moralism or relativism. And in the book, in the white paper, I actually draw a mountain. And think of the gospel, which is, I'm saved by grace and faith alone, not by works. But my faith always, always leads to good works. That's the gospel. One way to put that is, I'm saved by faith alone, but not by faith which stays alone. And if you're down the mountain any clicks at all toward legalism, which says, well, I'm saved by my good works, or toward relativism, which says, well, it doesn't matter how I live, God just loves me, you lose the power of the gospel. If you're at the bottom of the mountains, you're not Christians at all. If you literally believe, well, it doesn't matter how I live, God just loves me, or if you literally believe that I'm saved by my good works. But most Christians, even though they articulate the gospel rightly, tend to live down one side or the other, and you lose the power, the life-changing power of the gospel if you're any clicks down either side. So the gospel is neither relativism or legalism. Thirdly, we have to realize that what that means is the gospel changes our understanding of the law. The relativist says, well, we don't have to obey the law anymore. The legalist says we have to obey the law. And that's the only way to be saved. But a Christian understands that the law is no longer a system of salvation, but a welcome rule of life. Because now my motivation is to say, I want to please the one who saved me. I want to be like the one who saved me. How do I do that? And the answer is the law of God. Because the law of God is not busy work. The law of God is essentially a reflection of what God loves and hates. It's a reflection of who he is. So now I look at the law of God as something I do need to obey, but I don't do it as a system of salvation or a terrible duty. Instead, what I see it as a welcome rule of life, a way for me to love and please and resemble the one who did all this for me. And fourth, I'm only going to take 15 seconds on this, the gospel changes everything. And that's what, when we get to the white paper on gospel renewal, we will see that. The implications of the gospel are not, the gospel doesn't just save you, but the gospel changes your relationship to God, to yourself, to other people, to other races, to other classes, to the rich, to the poor, to the created environment, to everything. Lastly, let me just say this. I mentioned this in The Reason for God, so some of you have heard me say this, but there's a great book by Charles Dickens called Tale of Two Cities. And the Tale of Two Cities, there's two men that both love a woman named Lucy, Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton. Both love her, but Lucy chooses Charles Darnay. And they live in the time of the French Revolution. And it turns out that Charles gets arrested, and he's in the dungeon, and I guess in the Bastille, and he's going to be executed the next day, guillotine. Sidney Carton, in an act of incredible love, steals into there, because Sidney Carton looks somewhat like Charles Darnay. He goes in, he knocks Charles Darnay out. His friends steal him out and take him off to England so he can be with his family and be safe. And Sidney Carton stays in the dungeon, ready to die in the place of Charles Darnay. And there's a place where a young girl who's a seamstress, who's also going to die the next day, comes up to him and starts talking to him, thinking it's Charles Darnay, and she looks and she realizes this is not Charles Darnay, and she says, "Are you dying for him?" And Sidney Carton says, "Yes, for him and for his wife and child." And she says, "Oh, stranger, I don't know that I can face it tomorrow, but could I hold your hand when we go out tomorrow? Because I think if you held my hand, I might have the courage to face what I have to face." And he said, "Of course." You see, his substitutionary sacrifice filled her with courage, transformed her when she saw it. And it wasn't even for her. How much more will Jesus Christ's substitutionary sacrifice for you and me transform us if we live with it, if we pray it into our hearts, and if we celebrate the gospel every day?